The old, abandoned gas station sat like a ghost at the edge of Millfield, its weathered sign creaking in the wind. Most locals avoided the place, claiming it was haunted by the past. But the only spirit that haunted those grounds was a living one, a skeletal German shepherd with matted fur and eyes that had long lost their sparkle. They called him Shadow, though no one had officially named him. He was just there, a fixture of the landscape, as permanent as the rusted gas pumps and broken windows. Some said he'd been left behind when the station's owner died suddenly 5 years ago. Others claimed he belonged to a family passing through who heartlessly abandoned him. Whatever the truth, Shadow had spent 5 long years waiting at that station, surviving on scraps from rare kind-hearted strangers and whatever he could scavenge. Maria Chun drove past the station twice daily on her commute to the animal shelter where she worked. For years, she'd noticed the dog, always at a distance, always watchful, always alone. She'd tried approaching him countless times, armed with treats and gentle words, but Shadow would retreat into the decaying building, his trust in humans long shattered. "That poor thing needs help," Maria would tell her colleagues. "He won't make it through another winter." But Shadow had defied those predictions for 5 consecutive winters, becoming something of a local legend. The dog that couldn't be caught. The dog that wouldn't leave his post. On a particularly bitter November morning, Maria's ancient sedan sputtered and died just a quarter-mile past the gas station. Cursing her luck and the biting cold, she pulled out her phone to call for help, only to find the battery dead. With no choice but to seek shelter, she trudged back toward the abandoned station, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The building offered little protection from the elements. Broken windows had long ago surrendered to nature's intrusion, and the roof sagged dangerously in several places. As Maria huddled in what once was the cashier's area, she heard a soft whimper from the back room. "Shadow," she called softly, her voice echoing in the empty space. The whimpering continued, but it wasn't the alert, defensive sound she'd expected. It was weak, pained, the sound of surrender. Heart pounding, Maria followed the noise to a small storage room. There, curled in a nest of old rags, lay Shadow. The proud, elusive dog who had survived abandoned for 5 years was now barely moving, his once alert eyes clouded with pain and fever. Beside him lay an empty water bowl, one Maria herself had left months ago during a failed attempt to help him. "Oh, Shadow," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The dog didn't growl or try to escape as she approached. He simply looked at her with an expression that broke her heart. Not fear, not distrust, but a weary acceptance that his long vigil might finally be ending. For the first time in 5 years, when Maria reached out her hand, Shadow didn't pull away. Maria knew she couldn't leave Shadow in this condition. The storm was worsening, and the dog's labored breathing told her that waiting even a few more hours might be too late. With gentle movements, she removed her thick winter coat and carefully draped it over the trembling animal. "I'm going to help you," she whispered, not knowing if Shadow understood, but hoping the soft tone would reassure him. "But I need you to trust me." Shadow's eyes, though clouded with pain, followed her every movement. 5 years of isolation had taught him to be wary, to expect betrayal. When Maria attempted to slip her arms beneath him, he let out a low, warning growl, his body's automatic response despite his weakness. "I know, boy. I know it's scary," Maria said, tears streaming down her face as the freezing air bit at her now exposed arms. "But sometimes we have to be brave even when we're terrified." Her phone still dead and help miles away, Maria knew she had only one option. She would have to carry Shadow back to her car and somehow get it started again. The quarter-mile journey felt impossible in the biting cold with a 70-pound dog, but looking at Shadow's frail body, she realized he likely weighed much less than he should. With a deep breath, Maria gently slid her arms under the frightened animal. To her surprise, after a momentary tension, Shadow relaxed slightly, as if surrendering to whatever fate awaited him. The gesture nearly broke Maria's heart. This wasn't trust, but the resignation of an animal too exhausted to fight anymore. The journey back to her car was brutal. The wind howled, driving icy pellets of sleet into Maria's face as she staggered through snowdrifts, her precious burden held tight against her chest. Shadow remained utterly still, his only movements the shallow rise and fall of his chest and the occasional whimper when Maria stumbled. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Just a little further." By some miracle, when Maria finally reached her car and managed to lay Shadow across the back seat, the engine turned over on the first try. The heater sputtered to life, and she directed every vent toward the shivering dog. The drive to the animal shelter was a blur of white-knuckled focus through near-blizzard conditions. Maria called ahead using the car's Bluetooth, and by the time she arrived, Dr. Patel, the shelter's veterinarian, was waiting at the door with a stretcher. "He's been out there for 5 years, Maria explained, her voice breaking as they rushed Shadow inside. "I've been trying to help him for so long, but he never let anyone close until today." Dr. Patel's examination revealed the extent of Shadow's condition: severe malnutrition, hypothermia, an infected wound on his back leg, and heartworm disease. The prognosis was guarded at best. Shadow would need intensive care, medications, proper nutrition, and something more elusive than any medical treatment: a reason to fight, a reason to trust again. "We'll do everything we can," Dr. Patel assured Maria, "but after so long on his own, some dogs reach a point where they just give up." That night, Maria stayed at the shelter, sitting beside Shadow's kennel, talking softly to him as he drifted in and out of consciousness. She told him about her own life, about growing up in foster care, about understanding what it meant to be abandoned, about learning to trust again. "We're not so different, you and I," she whispered, reaching through the bars to gently stroke his ear. "And I promise you, Shadow, if you fight to stay, you'll never be alone again." In the dim light of the recovery room, Shadow's eyes opened and fixed on Maria's face. For the briefest moment, something flickered there, not resignation, not fear, but the faintest glimmer of something that had been missing for 5 long years: hope. The following weeks tested both Shadow's will to live and Maria's resolve. There were nights when Dr. Patel called her at home, warning that Shadow might not make it until morning. There were days when even the smallest progress, Shadow accepting food from Maria's hand or managing to stand for a few seconds, felt like miracles worth celebrating. Recovery was a fragile, painful process. The heartworm treatment was particularly grueling, forcing Shadow to remain calm and quiet when every instinct told him to run, to hide, to protect himself. Yet something had changed in those eyes that once held only wariness. When Maria spoke to him, Shadow listened. When she stayed late at the shelter, sleeping on a cot beside his kennel, he would watch her with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than mere animal survival. "He's bonding with you," Dr. Patel observed one evening as Shadow rested his head on Maria's lap during his medication. "I've never seen a dog so traumatized make this kind of connection. It's remarkable." 3 months after that fateful winter rescue, Shadow was deemed healthy enough to leave the shelter. The question of his future, however, remained uncertain. Several families had expressed interest in adopting the miracle dog, whose story had spread throughout the community, but Maria felt a knot in her stomach each time potential adopters came to meet him. "I know it's unprofessional," she confessed to Dr. Patel, "but I can't imagine sending him home with someone else." On Shadow's last scheduled day at the shelter, Maria arrived with a collar, a leash, and adoption papers already completed. She'd spent weeks preparing her small apartment, installing baby gates, purchasing the softest dog bed she could find, and reading every book on rehabilitating traumatized dogs. As she approached Shadow's kennel, something extraordinary happened. The dog who had spent 5 years avoiding human contact, who had initially trusted Maria only out of desperate necessity, stood up and wagged his tail. It wasn't the enthusiastic greeting of a dog who had never known suffering, but the deliberate gesture of one who had made a conscious choice to believe again. When Maria opened the kennel door, Shadow didn't rush past her toward freedom. Instead, he stepped forward and pressed his head against her legs, a gesture of such profound trust that Maria fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around his now healthy frame as tears streamed down her face. "Let's go home," she whispered. The transformation over the following year astonished everyone who had known Shadow's history. The fearful, skeletal dog from the abandoned gas station gradually became a different animal entirely. His coat grew thick and glossy, his eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. He learned to play with toys, to accept gentle petting from Maria's friends, to enjoy walks in the park rather than cowering at every unexpected sound. Perhaps most remarkably, Shadow developed an uncanny ability to sense when Maria was sad or anxious, pressing against her or placing his head on her lap in moments when she needed comfort most. The dog who had been failed by humans had somehow retained the capacity to offer unconditional love. On the anniversary of Shadow's rescue, Maria took him for a drive. They parked across from the abandoned gas station where he had spent those 5 lonely years. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, looking out at his former prison with calm detachment. "You waited for someone who never came back," Maria said softly, scratching behind his ears. "But you don't have to wait anymore." As if understanding her words, Shadow turned away from the window and rested his head on Maria's shoulder, not looking back at the past, but forward to the future they would share. In that moment, Maria realized that in saving Shadow, She had also saved herself, finding in his resilience a reflection of her own strength and in his capacity for trust, a lesson in what it means to truly live again. The dog abandoned for 5 years had found not just a home, but a purpose, reminding everyone who heard his story that even the most broken hearts can heal, and even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for a love that transforms both the rescued and the rescuer.